Today I have a whole bunch of things to share with you. The question that I was asked to actually address was this one: why creativity? And I want to define my terms about what I mean by creativity. Why creativity? Why creativity now? So I'm going to address this question. I'm going to stand away from whatever is making that feedback. I'm going to stand right here. I want to address that question at a very, very personal level. Stacy and Marcy encouraged me to actually speak to you about my personal journey, which is something that normally doesn't come in to the room when I do these kinds of talks. So I want to talk about that personally and see if there's some resonance for you as well in this question and what it feels like to be a creative leader. And second of all, I want to talk about it at a professional level. So what does it mean as a leader in industry and business today? And what does it mean as a marketer? And then last, I want to talk about what it means at an organizational level. Can somebody tell me? Okay, great. I want to talk about it at an organizational level, which is to say, what does creativity mean today in this market, in this climate, and what do we need to do to unlock the rest of the organization? And I'm going to explain to you a little bit more my point of view about why it matters more than ever today. And above all, what I want to leave you with is some strategies and some tools and some tactics. So by the end of this conversation, we're going to try some stuff. I'm going to tell you a lot of stories about how my company works, and then we're going to actually put some of those into practice through group conversation. I've got some questions to provoke you. And then we'll have a share back, and then we'll be done until we'll go on to the next speaker. So let me define what I mean by creativity, which is nothing more or less than the capacity to, can you read this? To have, to embrace, and to execute against new ideas continually. So having ideas is one thing. And by the way, that's not the most important part. People think, I have this idea and it's golden. I'm like, good luck with that. Because we know that ideas have to march through this kind of, this process of going out into the world. So it's not just having them, it's how you hold those ideas and how you steward them. And then last but not least, it's how you execute against them. And that includes rallying the troops around ideas, not just your ideas, but any ideas. And you'll see the importance of the idea goes away, and the most important thing is how teams fall in together in order to bring them to life. Okay, by the way, I have a graphic designer who kind of went crazy on the transitions, so his exuberance will be very much in evidence in this presentation. So this is me in a, you can't really tell here, but in a very wrinkled dress. And the reason I put this picture up here is because it's the beginning of a prototype that we're working on at IDEO. And this prototype is looking at ways that we can sort of get rid of those sort of deadly dull bios that we all have to put on our websites. And we're playing, now I can get like my real voice and get really loud. We're playing with ways that we can actually bring all that text off the page and bring it to life and connect it to the person to make people look more engaging. Because after all, at IDEO, we're a design firm. We want to show up as the creative weirdos that we really are. And we want that to come through really quickly in our website. So we're playing with this right now. So let's take the emphasis off my wrinkled dress and look specifically at some of this content. So here's a little bit about me. My name is Whitney Mortimer. My true passion, the thing I'm thinking about right now, in fact, I am birding right now. I'm looking for any birds that might enter this room, and I'm going to be identifying them for you if any happen to show up. And then here's some of the things that I care a lot about. I care a lot about women's justice and do work in that space. I care about diversity and inclusion. I am a recovering wine snob, having spent so much time in the wine industry. I'm trying to not care whether I'm drinking great wine or pretty good wine. Pretty good is good enough. So here's some of the stuff I care about. I care about building brands rooted in purpose and meaning. I don't want to do marketing that doesn't have meaning and doesn't connect to purpose, and I'll say more about that. And I'm very involved in conservation, trying to figure out if we can put more of what I've learned in my years at IDEO into the field of conservation and environmental preservation. But this is the thing I want to focus on up here, this thing called Chief Marketing Officer. So I'm here to tell you a little secret. I don't like that term. I don't relate to that term. I use it because the world responds to it. But it's not how I think about how I go out in the world to create value for my company or connect to other people. In fact, the way I think about my role is this. And I'll tell you, I think of myself as a strategist. In fact, I I studied strategy. I taught strategy for a while, and strategy has its own problems. But I do think of myself as a sort of a conceptual thinker. But specifically where I like to be is between the folks, typically CEOs and other leaders, who have an idea about where they want to go with the organization or in the world, or they have a big idea, but they're not really sure how to get there. And I like being the person that's standing there saying, where do you want to go? Let me help you get there. And then I can turn to a group of talented, motivated people, and we can say, let's do this together. And we can understand how to bring that vision to life. So that's what I mean by sense maker in chief. Now, it's not just enough to basically be sitting in between the folks who have the vision, and I can have a vision too, but I'm very inspired by people who have bigger visions than I do. And I'm very inspired by people who have better craft than I do. And I like to serve both of those groups by sitting in between. And that means I have to be in the room. I can't be handed a PowerPoint deck and be told where the organization wants to go and then get on with it. I have to iterate. I have to sit in that room. I have to hear the problems. I have to hear the challenges. I have to push back. I have to ask hard questions. And so the first thing that I will leave with you is, are you sitting in the room where you get to soak in those questions about the biggest aspirations of the company? Now, I think this is a creative endeavor. That process of shifting out of the where you want to go and how you're going to get there is a matter of having ideas, being able to embrace ideas, socialize those ideas, and then execute against those ideas. And I find that really, really energizing as a person. And it's what's kept me in this industry for a really long time. I happen to work for a company where the goods are good, and there's more content to work with, more stories than I ever had in any other marketing job that I ever had in my life. So that really helps. But it's a different orientation, and it's different than what I understood, when I went to business school years ago, and they said marketing's job is to build demand and all those things. It's the sense making that I find is the creative act that I enjoy so much. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more about what creativity has to do with leadership and also what it might have to do with marketing. And in order to do that, here we go, Joel with his transitions again. In order to do that, I need to tell you a little bit about how, in response to the question that Stacey put out there, I need to tell you how I got to this place, how I got to start working with IDEO. And I'll tell you more about who IDEO is in a minute. But first I want to introduce you to this guy, Griffin. And apologies for having to stare at this poor Griffin's kind of snarling, miserable face. But it's important. Because here I was, about 24 years ago, as Senior Vice President of Marketing. I also covered research, and I covered new business development as well at a little outfit called Supercuts. Anybody had an $8 haircut? Anybody get out with an okay haircut? I hope it didn't go too badly for you. That is a tough job to be in a, we had 1,200 stores around the world, and we used to say every haircut's a new chance to fail. It is tough. It is tough. And I don't mean to, slag off, my ex-employer. I just think it's a really hard thing to teach frontline employees how to do something as difficult as giving a haircut. In fact, it takes 23 different skills, communication skills, visual skills, eye-hand coordination skills, et cetera, in order to deliver a good haircut. And you're doing that, you're doing it over and over again like an assembly plant, right? But in any case, here I am sitting there on top of this kind of stack of responsibilities at Supercuts. And among other things, I'm the head of research, so there's nothing you can't tell me. There's nothing you can tell me about my customers that I don't think I already know. Because we're doing all the tracking studies and all the perceptual mapping and I'm sitting in dark rooms eating M&Ms, with mirrors and doing focus groups all the time. And I know my customers. I know their motivations, I've segmented them, et cetera. I hire IDEO. Different part of my world is I'm trying to think about how to kill my industry by spinning up something new, something that works better, something that delivers better results for customers. I hire this little design firm called IDEO, very modest group of people. And they come in and they say, we would like to do some research. And being a really sharp leader, I said, forget about it. I'm going to line through that line item. I will back up a truck to your house on Saturday morning, drop off all the research, read the research, we're done. And they said, no, we want to do a different kind of research. We want to sit and look and watch. I said, what kind of research is that? And so that's what they did. I said, stay out of the way, but they sat in our stores for a couple of days, and they just observed. And they talked to a few of the folks that were delivering haircuts, and they talked to a few customers, but not many. This is not a projectable sample of people, so I don't really understand how this is research. And what they came back with was, they kept me in my big mahogany conference room, and they've got this crummy Bristol board with like Polaroids. It's the 90s. And they're holding up these Polaroids. And one of the lead researchers holds up this Polaroid and says, this is Griffin. He is your customer. He would love to come see you every 6 weeks. He doesn't, because this is the most appalling experience that he has to go through every 6 weeks. First of all, you have terrible lighting, and he's green and kind of yellowish, and it's all coming from the top, so it's throwing shadows down his face. Second of all, you took that cape, and you're so smart because you actually put your Supercuts logo on backwards so that when he's sitting in the chair, it reflects backwards in the mirror, so he actually can read it side to side. Brilliant. Except for the fact, when you put that cape on him, you technically cut off his arms. You took away all his power. And then when you sprayed him down, you made him look terrible, funny, odd. And he feels incredibly vulnerable sitting in that chair. So he really hates it when he goes out into the world after, he got an okay haircut. He gets the same haircut every time, a number whatever clipper, and it's always exactly the same. And he goes out into the world and people go, hey, nice haircut, or I see you got your ears lowered. And he hates that because he just doesn't want people to notice. He just wants a tune-up. But he came in after 9 weeks, and therefore it's really obvious, right, that he just had his haircut. So this is not working at all for him. And in that moment, my life changed because I realized I didn't know anything about my customers. I couldn't see into their emotions. I couldn't see what the true motivations were. And what we did see in that moment was we had a whole nother opportunity to change, to actually reinvent the industry, to reinvent haircutting. So it wasn't just getting to a better outcome from a rational point of view. It was about creating a better emotional experience for the people that we were serving every day. And that meant we had to find a way to get rid of that water. Not easy. That's a regulatory requirement. You cannot cut hair in some number of states without running water present or without wetting down the hair and doing various other things. You had to get rid of the cape. Well, that's a problem because all that itchy stuff's going to go down. So what are we going to do there? So that put us on a trajectory. Having that kind of emotional insight into our customers put us on a completely different trajectory to understand our customers. And we got to something that was quite glorious. It had a clipper. It had a vacuum built in. This is an enormous engineering challenge. The company went upside down. We were a typical multi-unit service provider that was growing very fast, was a Wall Street darling, and we kind of redlined around some of the ways that we were transferring costs, between starting up stores and back to the corporation. And so another company came in and bought the company during a moment of duress. I left. They promptly took this new idea and threw it off a bridge because it was new, it was innovative, it was disruptive. The company that bought us was the largest haircut provider in the world, and they did not want anything out there that was going to disrupt the way business worked. And that was typical in this time, which is do line extensions, build on what you've got, but don't disrupt from the middle. That's very, very hard to pull off, and probably it wasn't the right kind of organization to go on that journey anyway. This is when I took off, lived in a van, drove around Central America for a while, and I thought to myself, I can't go back to working the way I worked before. I have to work in this new way. I don't know how that's going to happen. And that's suddenly one day there was a phone call, and I found my way to IDEO. That's how I got to IDEO. First a revelation, then a moment understanding that the organization couldn't hold this kind of disruptive thinking, and then a moment of opportunity where I got to step into that crazy organization and figure out what we could do together. Here's the first thing we did together. And I'm going to hope this plays.
Tonight, the deep dive. One company's secret weapon for innovation. We went to IDEO, the product design folk, and said, take something old and familiar, like, say, the shopping cart, and completely redesign it for us in just 5 days. ABC News correspondent Jack Smith tells us what happened next.
9 in the morning, day one, and these people have a deadline to meet.
So welcome to the kickoff of the shopping cart project.
This is Palo Alto, California, in the heart of Silicon Valley, and these are designers at IDEO, probably the most influential product development firm in the world.
All right, that's enough of that. Okay, that was back in the days when I was wearing like khaki pleated trousers and blue shirts in order to blend in with all the engineers I was working with. So we did this. What this was it was a PR moment where we basically reached out to a bunch of, an ABC News producer who came in and said, I want to know what kind of weird stuff's coming out of this like funny Silicon Valley firm. And so we'd like to put that on the nightly news. And when we walked him through the way we were working to create these new-to-the-world innovations, he said, I think there's a bigger story here, and it's how you're working. That's not going to play on the nightly news because we're going to need more time. So let's put this on Nightline. And that ended up being a 22-minute piece of video that covered how we worked. And it showed, as they say, the crazies in the cage. It took people inside the zoo. And what was sort of funny about this is the first airing, 6 million people, this is back in the day when 6 million people watched the same television program, 6 million people saw this program. And of course, the phone's ringing off the hook, and I'm a big hero, but it's all the wrong people calling. And then they ran it again, so 4 million people. So it's like rerunning the news. And now 10 million people have seen it, and now our website is collapsing under the weight. And still, it's the wrong people calling, because the people who are calling are like, I got an idea. You can take my idea. You can take that to market. Just give me all the money, and I'll give you a little bit back. I'm like, that's not what we do. But here's what did happen. That shopping cart video scratched an itch. First of all, those 10 million people were responding to it very powerfully, not because of IDEO, but because there was a big idea baked into the middle of this that was very powerful for them. Second of all, the other thing that was happening was it was going into every training program, every graduate training program, every corporate training program in America, because of this big idea that was baked into the middle of it. And that is what has made all the difference. I'm not saying that I was good. I'm saying I'm incredibly lucky that this amazing production team found this idea. And here's what the idea is. Here's what the idea is. There is a better way to work together. So this wasn't about like, here's what IDEO does. This was, oh my gosh, people are working together. 1 + 1 = 3 when people get together in a group, and they're able to get farther, faster. And this is the radical idea on which our funny little company has a bigger brand than we deserve. People want to put themselves in that idea. That idea has incredible resonance. And it had resonance back when this aired in 1999, and it still has resonance today. We are still surfing that wave, if you will. And in fact, I'd say today that idea has more resonance than ever, because we're sitting in a moment where disruption and AI and data and algorithms are starting to become the currency of how we're thinking about business and creating value in the world. And those are very hard concepts to hold. They're a bit scary. And I think people are sitting here today saying, I am afraid to step into this future. I'm afraid to step into this future because I don't understand it, and because, even worse, I might lose myself. I might lose my humanity. My company might lose its soul as we step into that place. So this is the thing I'd like to share with you, which is, can you think about what you're working on, what you're doing today, and look behind the rational expression of what that is, and find what is activating people emotionally about that value proposition, because that is far more powerful in building brands than the rational. Now, you have to have the rational in the equation. We draw this at IDEO all the time. We draw it for ourselves, we draw it for our clients. But it's this idea that if you're purely over here on the side of the money, which is my way of representing the rational, that you're going to miss not just the opportunity to make a more compelling place to work and a more compelling way to engage with an organization, you're going to miss the power behind your value proposition. So I encourage you to do that work, to tunnel into what you can activate. And you activate that through stories and storytelling. And that happens internally and it happens externally. Okay. That's what's going on for me personally, and that's my big breakthrough and aha in terms of what it means to be a creative leader sitting in the middle of this space. To take you to the next level, which is to say, what are some of the strategies? How does this actually happen? I need to tell you a bit more about IDEO, and I apologize in advance if this comes across as, selling from the stage, if you will, because I am the chief Kool-Aid pourer at IDEO, and I mix this stuff really thick, and I started to wave my arms around because I am genuinely excited about what I've learned and what I've been able to share from spending 21 years in this organization. Not just this as CMO, but also working with a lot of clients. And so here we are in this post-apocalyptic environment in San Francisco. This is our building. You can't see because the lights aren't working quite well here, but this is the water right here of San Francisco Bay. That's the Bay Bridge. We have this entire wharf that's basically on the Embarcadero in San Francisco. And that's just one location that we have. We're in 9 locations around the world. And you can't see this because of the light, but this is the entire staff, about 280 of us in the San Francisco location standing out on this little dock. And the great thing is that my office is my desk is right here, and the birds are right there. I can bird from my desk, which is really, really awesome. And it feels like this on the inside. No kidding. It really does feel like this on the inside. This picture was taken when we moved everybody out of that office I just showed you, made them commute an hour to Palo Alto down south so we could remodel that San Francisco location. And we called it the Summer of Love. And we packed 280 people in alongside another 100 people down in Palo Alto and said, we're just going to make this fun because it's terrible and we hate it, but we're going to make it fun this summer. And we took this picture of making it fun. So we're about 700 people, mostly designers, many different kinds of designers working all over the world, and we have a big mission. We are a bit of a cult. We really believe that design can change the world, and we're doing that by working with business and society and helping them become more design-friendly. So this company, I don't know if any of you know, was founded by a guy named David Kelly, who you might have seen him in the Charlie Rose piece that was shared, the 60 Minutes piece that was passed around as some of the pre-read. But this is an extraordinary man. You know how they say, this is a terrible thing, but the fish stinks from the head down? This fish smells very good at IDEO because all of the values and the qualities of the firm come from this man's heart and his beautiful, beautiful mind. So when he was an engineer studying electrical engineering and working with Boeing and National Cash Register and places like that, he was dying a small death in those organizations because what he learned was that you have a great idea, comes out of research maybe, comes from the world, don't know, then it gets thrown over the silo or the cubicle into the world of design, over another cubicle or silo into the world of engineering, over a cubicle, and then the marketers get their hands on it, and then accounting gets their hands on it, and logistics, and next thing you know, you're shipping something to market that is unrecognizable from the power of that original idea. He hated that. He went to Stanford, and he was studying for his PhD, and he's like, I'm not going to do a PhD. I'm going to start my own firm. Helps that he had a really well-known friend, a guy named Steve Jobs, who had a challenge for him and said, we need some work making a certain number of things come to life, and we think you know how to do that. So he took a couple of his friends from Stanford, went over the railroad tracks in Palo Alto, started a little firm called IDEO, or the roots of IDEO in 1978. In 2005, he took everything he learned from IDEO back to Stanford and started the Stanford D School, D.School, but it's the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design. You cannot get a degree from Stanford in what he teaches. What he's teaching is collaboration. What we now know today is design thinking. What Stanford decided to invest in, with David's help, was making every single school, the law school, the business school, the school of nursing, the medical school, the school of social sciences, the school of engineering, capable of accessing classes on how to work better together, how to really cultivate teamwork and collaboration. Because David and the leaders of the D School at that time, of Stanford at that time, had a strong belief that these were the skills that, frankly, were going to get us to where we needed to go in industry, in business and society. So we start with IDEO back in 1978 and into the 80s, Their first hits working with people like Steve Jobs were some of the seminal things that you're using every day. And this is sort of the foundational stuff, like what we're known for. But we did design the first mouse for Apple. Let me tell you what it goes into designing the first mouse. First of all, you've never heard of a mouse. The word doesn't exist yet. Nobody's barely used a computer. And you're going to have to figure out what this external peripheral interface is going to be like. And you got 6 buddies from Stanford who are going to figure this out together. The first thing is this technology existed, as most technologies do when we get our hands on them. This technology had been developed by Xerox PARC, by SRI, Stanford Research Institute, and it had 6 billion moving parts. It was very expensive, and you had to have a PhD to be able to manipulate this giant external device that required 4 arms and legs in order to operate it. And Steve Jobs gave us a beautiful brief. He said, make it usable by regular humans and make it manufacturable for $20. And so you're like, good, I got a brief. Now what do you do? Well, what these guys did is they walked down the street to Walgreens, and they bought a soap dish, and that felt good in their hand. And they started playing around. Well, maybe not the soap dish, maybe this butter dish will do. And they start playing. And they ultimately found a form factor that they felt was inspiring enough to want to make that the form factor they were working with. Now you've got to deal with the inside. And what they realized is they needed 360 degrees of movement in their little mouse. And there's no such thing as a trackball yet, but they conceived of this trackball. Now you've got another problem. Trackball has to be sticky as you roll it around the table, but not stick to the table. And it's got to be very, very sensitive and responsive. Great, we're going to coat it with rubber. Here's a problem. If you coat it with rubber, what's the manufacturing technique so you don't get a little dimple so that there's a boom, when you're rolling your mouse around on the table? So these are the kind of systemic problems. This is a simple example of a system that needs to be broken down into tiny little parts in order to get traction. This is the foundation of how we work, which is making complicated problems that you can see the whole thing. There's a holism to the system you want to deal with, and you want to break those down into small, tractable pieces of problems. This happened as well with early laptops. This shouldn't say the first laptop. This is the Grid Compass. It was a luggable computer that had the first clamshell format. To do the clamshell, you've got to figure out how to get the wires through so they're not snapping every time you're opening that thing. And some of you are probably my age and remember what it meant to go from that big hunk of plastic carried by dorks, and you put it in your pocket and you'd be like, boom, walking along like this. And so this was a breakthrough, not because anything happened with the interface on this screen. This was a breakthrough because it was slim, it was beautiful, it was aspirational to carry, it had inductive charging rather than wires all over the place. And this is not an easy thing. You're going to use stamped anodized aluminum in this product that had never been applied to anything but Japanese cameras. All the technology for that is going to be over in Japan. So we got to go find that. And there's a bunch of other things that make it more usable. It's got a rail system. You can stick stuff on the side, like a stylus or a cover. So you can start to see how making this desirable to humans is what takes something that doesn't change its inherent performance. It can't do anything that the Palm Pilot couldn't do before. And yet, here's what happened. Women said, I'll put that in my purse. And people who were not, sort of the geeks who loved the early adopter kind of technology said, that makes sense in my executive trousseau. So that's what made the possibility of putting a computer in your pocket possible. So these are very human considerations as much as they're technical considerations. And we weren't just working in the world of technology, we were working in the world of saving lives through health. A third of our business at that time was health. This is the defibrillator that you will find in every plane, train, and public place now, that we're basically a 10-year-old can administer this thing. If they can see somebody potentially having a heart attack and understand that might be what it is, you can follow the instructions. You have to know how to speak the language that is spoken by the machine because it's going to talk to you, and you have to be able to read those charts in order to be able to know where to stick them on somebody's body, and then you stand back and the rest does it for itself. This has been a massive intervention, and this is my favorite of all. This is basically an insulin pen that allows people to dial their dose, but more importantly, not just stand there in the privacy of their bedroom or bathroom dialing that dose. You can dial the dose as you're sitting in a restaurant unsurreptitiously under the table and inject yourself in the leg right there. This changes lives because it improves adherence to healthcare regimens. So it's that human factor that makes all the difference. And this is what we became famous for. And then we started to apply it to other things, like this is how you'll vote next month in LA County, the largest voting district in America. This is 100% ADA compliant. Anybody with any disability can vote using this machine. You can vote on your phone, and then you can feed that information into this device. It will create a paper trail. It does all these things. Very, very complex system, but ultimately it has to work for 100% of the people who are going to use it. This is a school in Peru. This is a problem of the emerging middle class not being able to access a school system that can keep up with the rate of growth in the country of Peru. We've got people coming out of poverty for the first time ever. The school system of the country cannot keep up. You have to conceive of the physical plant where they're going to learn, the curriculum, how you're going to train the trainers, the teachers, how you're going to utilize that space, and you have to conceive of a business model that's going to make it viable. We've got 43 of these schools open now, and this concept is doing radically better in terms of math and reading skills, and now it's being exported to other countries, specifically to Mexico. This is design in action when you put people at the center of a series of challenges, which are business challenges and technical challenges. And this is where we think more of the world needs to embrace these tools to understand how to apply them to their own challenges wherever they may sit. So what's going on here under the surface is, first and foremost, there is a way of thinking about people and teams that is really fundamental to understanding how this unfolds. People, I'm sorry, this is a little bit backwards, but T-shaped people are, this part is their skill, and this part is their empathy for others on the team. So it takes T-shaped people sitting in multidisciplinary teams. The challenges that we have today cannot be solved by lone geniuses. They have to be solved by people with lots of different skills. Sorry, let me go through this one more time. This is the T-shaped person. Deep skills, here, you're a great engineer. In fact, you might have more than one of these things. You're a great engineer and you're an architect. Or you're an MBA and you have a degree in design. You're a doctor and you also have a passion for architecture. That's increasingly the case, where we see these like multidisciplinary kind of people, thetas, I guess. And then the part on top is empathy, curiosity, optimism. So the idea here is you get the best engineer in the world and put them with the best researcher and put them with the best marketer. You got nothing until you have this on top, because they can't connect to each other. And we do have some of these folks. They're just purely excellent, and they don't collaborate that well. And they are part of our organization as well, but there's not many of them. And usually it's because they have such critical, rare expertise. But we deploy them in different ways. Most of the people that we have in our firm can work in multidisciplinary teams because they are deeply curious about what the other person knows and sees. Okay, this is the T-shaped person. And then this is the multidisciplinary team. If you get this mixture right, then you can put a food scientist, a journalist, a game designer, an interaction designer, a behavioral economist, et cetera, in the room together. And they can get really far on problems because they can connect very powerfully. Now, what else has to happen as part of that equation is they have to have some set of values that binds them together. Every firm will find their own set of values that works for them. This is our values. These are our values. This is a little red book. And that was a bit of a problem, actually, when we took our little red book to China, where we have an office there. We had to sort of change the color. It was just awkward. And we actually had to reinterpret it, by the way, because a lot of the language had to shift. And a lot of the values didn't map very well to some of the cultural things that were true in China. So we did a whole exercise where we reinterpreted our values through the lens of that particular community. But these are the things that bind these teams together for us. And this is not an idle exercise in writing our values down and then chucking it under the desk where it gathers dust. I hire using this book. So I go through every single one of these values when I hire a new person into our team. And when I have a problem or a great performer, and we're doing feedback or evaluations or performance reviews or whatever, this is active. I am looking at, if I have a problem, it's probably because one of these values is not showing up. Because presumably we've done a good enough job vetting for skills and productivity and all those things. But these are the things that, you know, you can't really build these things into people. You've got to hire for them. So we're very careful at IDEO to hire for these skills and to pay attention to whether or not they're actually being activated as people grow in their career journeys. The other thing is we do have a set of beliefs that bind us together as a community, regardless of what, you know, we've got offices all over the world, different cultures. We're working in Lima, and we're working in Berlin, and we're working in China and Japan, and all these different places. We have an office now in Nigeria. And yet everybody's bound together by these values, but also by these beliefs, that everyone is creative. Remember my definition of creativity. That creativity is learnable and teachable, and we can help people recover their creativity and then become more masterful in how they express it. And we also, and this is really important, creative organizations are more agile and resilient, and that is what we're going for today. That organizations today no longer work in a top-down model. They need to be generatively creative from the bottom up. New solutions, new responses, they need to be trusted to be able to respond to new problems, because the old models are too sclerotic and they won't work in this super fast-paced world. So this is really core to who we are. Now, some of the ways that we've been working for forever got a handle back in 2004 called design thinking. And some of you may have heard about design thinking, and some of you may have not. It's one of these weird things where there's a group of people who just discovered it very, very recently, and other people are like, oh, that old thing? So I don't know how both of these things could be true, but it's the world I'm living in where we're dealing with people who are just entering the beginning of their level of understanding around what design thinking is and why it could matter, and those who are saying, let's push this discipline as far as we possibly can. But for those who are not familiar with it, the idea here is, as I said before, you're always going to want to think about people. You're always going to have to consider that in the context of what is viable from a business point of view, and you're going to want to think about it from the point of view of what is technically feasible. But you're always going to come back to people around and around and around, over and over and over, iteratively. So we will always put people at the center of that equation. There are other kinds of folks who can bring things into the world who will not take that approach. That's a different approach. This is our approach. So let's go a little deeper and specifically talk about some of the things that are operating in terms of how we stay in that kind of iterative cycle of considering people first. And this is where I hope that you'll find something that you can try when you go back to work, whenever you go back to work, Monday. So back to what we were talking about before at the very beginning. You know, I came from a world where I spent a lot of money and time learning about what people were saying through interviews, focus groups, et cetera, and watching what they were doing. What are you buying? How much are you buying? How much more can I get you to buy? We want to live here in the world. When you're thinking about generating new ideas and going into the world with something that hasn't been done before and serving customers in new ways, you're working on this side of the ledger, which is, what do we think people are feeling, and what do we think they're thinking? And it takes a certain amount of skill to draw that out. In fact, there's mastery in how you can get to a very advanced level of starting to tunnel into that stuff. But that's what Jane, when she told me about what was happening with Griffin, that's what she was doing. And she was really expertly starting to go into the most visceral, latent needs of our customer. And this is where I think the power is for many of us to learn to get better at this. So learn to understand or appreciate what people are thinking and feeling that is not expressed, and master some of the techniques for doing that. So remember Griffin. The other thing is when you're taking inspiration in the world, if you're a marketer looking to sell a bunch of stuff, typically we've been taught, I was taught in business school to look at the middle of the bell-shaped curve, because that's where the volume is, right? But if you're trying to generate something new in the world, you'll look at the edges. You look at the extreme. So here's my favorite example. When we started working with Birkenstock to reinvent, sort of what could they offer beyond those gorgeous sandals that they are known for, tell who doesn't like them. I love them, but we didn't go out and talk to, hippie sandal wearers. We went out and we talked to a foot fetishist. We went out to a historian at a museum who has been collecting footwear across the ages. We went and talked to podiatrists. who basically treat, sort of rare structures in feet. So we're looking for the people who are sort of at the edges. That's where new ideas come from. That's where you get out of your understanding of the volume problem and you get into the new ideas about how you can serve people differently. And it's really fun, super fun. And we also learn not just from extreme users, we learn from what we call analogous experiences. So that requires some creativity to think about. If you are redesigning a crash cart for a high-performing surgical team in a hospital, let's not go look, we're going to, of course, look at surgical teams in hospitals, lots of them. But we're also going to go look at NASCAR and see what it means to be in a high-pressure, loud, high-performance, high-consequence environment when the car rolls into the pit and you need to get those tires off and put the new tires on and know that the car is not going to leave while you're still working on the car. So there's lots to learn from analogous experiences. And here's something else. When you're trying to get more ideas into the room, this is where brainstorming breaks down and a lot of people say, oh, brainstorming doesn't work. Here's why it doesn't work. It's because we're mixing up what is the purpose of that brainstorm. A brainstorm is a divergent activity designed to get more ideas in the room. We go for 100. We set the timer for an hour, and we literally number every idea. And so we have to go fast. There's no time for judgment. And we write them down. 1, here's your idea. 2, here's another idea. 3, and when we're done, we got 100 ideas on the wall. What we're trying to do is avoid the kind of devil's advocates in the room who are like, well, let me tell you why that's not going to work. Because that's a convergent exercise. It's also kind of a jerky thing to do. But that is a convergent exercise when you're basically evaluating those ideas. Brainstorming is a divergent exercise. Now, this relates to more than just brainstorming. It's important to know when you're with your teams and you're working with groups where you're trying to figure out where to go, is this a moment where we're trying to get more options on the table, or is this a moment where we are trying to determine which is the best option? And it's not just one moment, it's everything you're doing. If you walk through your life at work, you'll start to realize that when we conflate those things, it's harder to get farther faster. So see if you can put a frame on the objective of any given meeting to be more options or choosing among existing options. Opening, closing, opening, closing. And that's what the iterative cycle of innovation feels like. It's basically you start with the world of possibilities. You start to narrow down, but you're still doing that opening and closing as you focus your efforts and move along in the innovation journey. All right, brainstorming rules, just so I can share with you. We have very specific rules. We actually paint them on the walls. Defer judgment, encourage wild ideas, build on the ideas of others, stay focused on the topic, one conversation at a time, be visual, and go for quantity. So it's a science. It's not an art. And usually, by the way, the person who's not allowed in the room is the person who cannot help themselves from being judgmental. That's often the boss. So the boss often isn't invited. In fact, the client is usually not invited. I got invited to a brainstorm when I was working with Supercuts, and I guess they thought there was something that in me that could tolerate crazy ideas like, I know, let's hang the customer upside down by gravity boots and use a chainsaw to cut their hair as they're upside down. And that's really funny, except that actually what it does is it lightens you up, it gets you moving faster, and frankly, other people can say, that's a crazy idea, but you know what, I got a different idea and I want to build on that, and it takes you into creative paths. It's like relaxing a muscle. So you can see why this is very, very terrifying for clients often. All right, next thing. So we've been talking about how to get a new insight. Now I'd like to turn to the power of prototyping. And a lot of people think of prototypes as, think it's something that makes a noise when you drop it. It's always physical. It's not. Prototypes have many, many, many different forms. The reason you have a prototype, which is to say an example of your idea, something tangible or something emotional, like it could be a story, it could be role-playing, it could be a narrative, it could be anything that starts to help the group crystallize around the power inside of an idea. And the reason you want to take prototypes into your meeting is if you go in and you present your perfect plan via PowerPoint or InDesign or Keynote, whatever you like, and you present that perfect plan, there's only 2 responses. Great idea or, that's all you got. And the power of a prototype is, first of all, it takes it out here, away from me. What do you think? I don't like it. Here, tell me what you like about it. Tell me what you don't like about it. How could we make it better? So what you're trying to do is get people to focus on the idea and help you build on that idea as opposed to just evaluate your idea, which can be very personal and also kind of, there's nowhere to go. So what you want to do is try to use a prototype to turn your conversation into a generative session as opposed to an evaluative session. And so we live and die by this rule. Prototypes take many forms. Here's an example of way back when dinosaurs roamed the earth and we were thinking about interfaces for that good old Palm 5 thing, or actually that's the Palm Pilot. And so, sticky note, good place to start with an interface. But in this case, this would have changed my life if I'd had this at Supercuts. This is general managers of the Marriott Town Place Suites. They're the people, because they're the owner-operators, who are going to have to invest $60,000 to $100,000 in building out a new store format. And the old way used to be lots of slides, lots of ROI analyses and things like that. Instead, we built this in a warehouse in South San Francisco out of foam core, and we let them walk through it, and they literally kicked the tires. They literally kicked the corner and said, yeah, that's going to get dented, and that's going to look terrible, and I'm going to have to pay to fix that. Or, my CPU is not going to fit under this reception desk. Or, that's a cool idea. It's so cool, I'd like to move it to the middle of the room. We can do that, and we move it to the middle of the room. So what you want is to drive risk out of your concepts earlier by having better prototypes that people can interact with. The other thing it does is it brings people along in the journey. It makes them feel part of the solution, and this is really powerful for organizations that are trying to convince other groups to make large investments. So fail early and often. And then here is a prototype, a more recent one that is, yeah. So you'll recognize what we're prototyping here. This is an interface for this newfangled device called an iWatch. I don't have one. What is it? Yeah, the iWatch, yeah. And so this is very simple. This is actually quite refined. Doesn't have to be that pretty, but there's a lot of ways to start to have a conversation that can be generative in very cheap, fast ways. Yeah? And then here is clear. You know what this is. This is business class for British Air. In the earliest stages, and this is in our London office, a crummy picture, and this is a more advanced prototype where now you're in a warehouse and you literally have electrified seats and you're prototyping what the service could be like. This is actually for Lufthansa. So this is a very refined level of prototyping. This is a famous surgical tool. This is actually a surgical tool for otolaryngologists who are doing the most disgusting surgery that you don't want to hear about. It's basically removing nasal polyps. But one of the doctors said, I need all of these wires and all this system that I'm dealing with now. It takes 2 nurses and myself to do this operation. I need it in a trigger. Show me. And they created this. So this is what you want to do, is get people involved in starting to express their ideas in these ways. And then it's about the ideas, not about you. And here's one last piece.
And it can go for as long as I want. It has a few signature moves.
This is for Sesame Street.
And when I've had enough, when I'm done
Prototyping a
dancing,
game.
I push the back button. It pauses and the music stops. Monster Maker.
Cool.
That's all I can. Come on, that's all I can.
That's just a piece of foam core. Okay. Companies that work this way, you have to trust me on this because I'm going to skip over and try to get to the end of my presentation. But companies that work like this are proven to be more valuable. This is a 2015 list, so don't look too closely at who's on this list because some of them might have had a stumble in the last couple of days. But this is the difference in the delta in their market valuation. And this is the difference that design makes. And there are ways to measure specifically what we mean by how design is playing out in these organizations. It's embedded in leadership. It exists in every business unit. There is a senior leader that is responsible for the design function, et cetera. And I say design, but what I mean is that the ability to bring more ideas to market better and faster is what ultimately we're measuring here. And second of all, there are very specific ways to understand. Today we can measure and manage exactly whether these activities are taking hold inside organizations. And so there are tools that help us do this. So we can measure whether leaders are fostering a clear sense of purpose that fuels the creative endeavor. We can measure teams that frequently are pinging their customers, pulsing their customers more than once a month, all the time. It's a way of being, a way of living in the organization. We can measure whether teams are producing enough ideas. If they're producing one idea at a time, it's probably not enough. We can measure whether teams are connecting across functions and how they're connecting in order to combine the power of their ideas. We can measure two more things. We can measure whether teams have enough decision-making authority and whether they have what they need to move forward. These are measurable things. And we can also measure teams that have a space to solve problems. Remember that iteration I was talking about where you're continually going back to customers to test or explore, you're continuing to build prototypes. You can measure those activities. And ultimately, that does add up to better performance that gets you to that higher valuation. So we know there's a correlation with working in this way. But don't believe me. IBM, little bitty company you probably heard of, did a study back in 2010. Remember, in 2010, we're just 2 years on the other side of one of the worst economic, situations the world's ever seen. And they did this study among 2,200 leaders around the world, CEOs of all kinds of firms, both business and social firms. And they were floored to discover that what was coming back was no longer the most important quality of a leader today is finance or M&A or all these operational acumen or all these things that had really gotten us to where we were, but for better or for worse, to where we were at the time. But that creativity was ascendant in the requirements of a great leader. Why would that have mattered? It was a recognition of what I was saying earlier, that organizations that were organized around a militaristic top-down, the decisions rolled down, waterfall from the top, are sclerotic. They can't move fast enough in a hyper-globalized system of systems that has enormous interdependencies, that is moving too quickly for the messages to get through the organization. So what leaders were starting to wake up to then, they already had in the 10 years prior, but they were starting to wake up to the fact that they needed strategies to basically unlock the creativity of their organization to be able to respond faster to problems that they saw on the ground. And this kicked off a search for the methods and the strategies that were going to make organizations more inherently creative and responsive and resilient. We're talking about agility and resilience. So we're going to try a little of this ourselves, and I'm going to leave you with two questions. The first thing, we're going to spend the next 10 minutes just talking amongst table groups about this. Where in your world can you gain a new insight through thinking about empathy for your customers in different ways, or clients in different ways?